Hello, welcome to our deep learning lecture. So in the last lecture we have talked about the gated recurrent units, which we said are a simpler form of the earlier proposed long short-term memory, which are the topic of this video. So let's get right into it. Long short-term memory is one of the earliest approaches to address this idea of long-term information preservation, and on the other side, short-term input skipping in the LSTM or in the recurrent network. The LSTM achieves this by introducing so-called memory cells. These memory cells, they are similarly to the hidden state, passed from time point to time point. However, while the hidden state is used to compute the output, the memory cell is only passed in the temporal direction from cell to cell. So it never is used to compute the output. It also controls the information flow of this memory cell using a number of gates that are inspired by logic gates in a computer. These gates are 1, the output gate, 2, the input gate, and 3, the forget gate. So the output gate reads entries from the current cell. The input gate decides when to read data into the cell, and the forget gate, resets the contents of the memory cell. And the motivation for this particular design is again to be able to decide when to remember and when to ignore the inputs into the latent state. Here we see parts of the LSTM, so this is not yet the complete cell. So again, in this chart, an arrow that goes in 2 directions means that the information is copied. If 2 arrows come together, then we concatenate the inputs here, and sigma is again a sigmoid function that goes from 0 to 1. The data that feeds into the LSTM gates are, the input to the current time step xt and the hidden state of the previous time step h t minus 1. So here we have h t minus 1, here we have the current input. These inputs are then passed in 3 different gates using a fully connected layer that then is passed through a sigmoid activation function sigma in each of those gates. And the result of this activation computes the values of these 3 gates, the input, forget, and output gate. As a result of using a sigmoid activation function, all the elements of these 3 gates lie in the range between 0 and 1. Let's look at the computations for mini batch gradient descent. So we have a mini batch of size little n, thus the inputs are a matrix of size n times d, the number of inputs. The hidden state at ht minus 1, we have n samples. Each of them has a hidden state of h dimensions, and the input gate it at our current time step thus is an n times h matrix, which is computed as the sigmoid applied to a fully connected layer of xt concatenated to ht. So each of them gets a weight matrix. So each of them, both xt and ht minus 1, are multiplied by a weight matrix. A bias is added. The forget gate ft similarly is computed to sigma applied to linear function of xt and ht minus 1 again. And the output gate ot is computed similarly by sigma applied to xt times a weight matrix, ht minus 1 times a matrix plus a bias. So we have all these different weight matrices, wxi, wxf, wxo. So these are the 3 weight matrices applied to the input to compute the input gate, to compute the forget gate, and to compute the output gate. We have WHI, WHF, and WHO. Those are the 3 weight matrices that are applied to the hidden variable to compute the input gate, forget gate, and output gate, and the bias terms BI of the input gate, BF of the forget gate, and BO of the output gate. The next cell that we introduce in our diagram is the so-called candidate memory, C tilde, which is an n number of samples times H matrix. In contrast to the forget input and output gate, so the 3 gates described above, it doesn't use a sigmoid function that goes from 0 to 1, but it uses the tanh function that yields a value range between -1 and 1 as an activation function. So this candidate memory cell C tilde t is computed as tanh applied to a linear function of xt and ht minus 1. So we have 2 additional weight matrices, wxc, which is applied to the inputs to compute the candidate memory cell, and whc, which is applied to the last hidden state to compute our candidate memory cell. And we have the bias bc added to this linear combination of x and h. Now we have computed these 4 gates, or these 3 gates, and the candidate memory cell. Let's look at how information flows. LSTM introduces into the network the so-called memory cell C, which similarly to the hidden state is passed from cell to cell along the recurrent chain. So the memory cell CT-1 is passed into our current cell, and our current cell then computes CT. And we will discuss how it's computed shortly, but then CT is passed on to the next cell. Yeah? So how is it computed? Well, our input parameter to the memory cell is on the one side the input gate. This governs how much we take the new data into account. And how do we take new data into account? Well, via our candidate memory. Candidate memory is computed using information from xt, our current inputs. Our forget parameter ft addresses how much of the old memory cell, CT-1, will be retained or forgotten. So CT is computed as the pointwise product or Hadamard product between ft, the forget parameter, and CT-1, plus it, the input parameter, pointwise times our candidate memory cell. So if ft is large and it is small, then past memory cells will be saved over time and passed on to step t. This design allows to alleviate the vanishing gradient problem, because we can pass information easily on, and it better captures dependencies for time series with long-range dependencies. Now, the new hidden state, ht, which then is again passed to the next cell and used to compute the output, is a gated version of the tanh applied to the memory cell. So we take our memory cell, CT, yeah, remember here we have already CT, and we apply tanh to it. Yeah? So here we have tanh h of ct, and this is multiplied pointwise with our output parameter ot, the output of the output gate. Thus, the values of the hidden state lie in the range of -1 and 1, because we apply an h and ct, and if ot is close to 1, then memory information is passed through to the predictor of the output, and if ot is close to 1, then all the information is retained only within the memory cell. So if ot is close to 1, then our memory cell does not go into the computation of the hidden state, which then is used to compute the output. So let's summarize. LSTMs have 3 different types of gate: input, forget, and output, which control the information flow in the network. The hidden layer output of LSTM includes hidden states and memory cells, but only hidden states are passed into the output layer. Memory cells are just internally, so they're only used to pass information from cell to cell. LSTMs can help cope with the vanishing and with the exploding gradients problems due to long-range dependencies and short-range irrelevant data. Often, LSTMs perform slightly better than GRUs, however, they are much more costly to train and also to execute because of the larger latent state size, because we have these additional memory cells and more gates. LSTMs are the prototypical latent variable autoregressive model with a state control that is non-trivial. Many variants have been proposed over time, for example, adding more layers, adding residual connections, or different types of regularizations. However, training LSTMs and other sequence models is quite costly due to the long dependencies of the sequence. Later in this lecture, we will look at alternative models that also can cope with long-range dependencies, but are much more efficient to compute, especially to parallelize. And those are the so-called transformers. They are more recent models. But for today, let's conclude. So I say thank you and goodbye. See you the next time.